God bless you this morning. On July the 2nd, 1982, there was a man by the name of Larry Walters who was one of the very few that won one of the Darwin Awards and lived to tell about it. Larry became known as Lawn Chair Larry. And here in a minute, Tyler's going to put a picture up here. Just gives you a visual to know this guy really existed. Lawn Chair Larry, he decided one day, he wanted to be a pilot from the time he was just a child. And he failed the test because his vision was bad. And so he decided, one point, he was sitting in his comfortable Sears lawn chair back in 1982. And he decided that he was going to get some weather balloons, and he was going to fill those up, and he was going to fly. And so Larry, he fills up, I think, 42 or 44 weather balloons with helium. And then armed with some sandwiches, some Miller Lite, and a pellet gun, he thought that he would go about 30 feet, and kind of sail around for a little bit and maybe shoot a balloon here and there and come back down. But when his friends cut the rope that was hooked to his Jeep, they said that Larry soared to a site altitude of 16,000 feet. Now, I don't know if you could put that in any kind of perspective, but Laura and I, we just went to Hanging Rock yesterday. We didn't actually walk up to Hanging Rock. We kind of went down to one of the waterfalls. But if you look at Hanging Rock up there, it's at like 2,200 feet. I mean, the highest thing in the United States, on the connected landmass of the United States, is a little over 14,000. Larry went to 16,000 feet in a lawn chair. And by that time, he was a little afraid to, take out his pellet gun. So he was up there for about 14 hours. And he flew past the Los Angeles airport where the corridor finally alerted people that he was there. He was cold. He was scared. Finally, he started shooting a balloon down here and there, and he got tangled up in the power lines in Long Beach and actually blacked out the community. Now, the federal aviation people decided, they said, well, we got to arrest him. We're not sure what he did wrong, but we know there's something. We'll figure it out. And so Larry, though, but when they were hauling Larry off, they asked him the question. It says, why did you do it? And this is what he said: a man can't just sit around. Now, I wish that we as Christians would feel that way and understand that we can't just sit around. I do not recommend getting weather balloons in a lawn chair when you go home. But we are Christians. We're disciples. That is the number one thing we're supposed to do, is be active. Now, I know here in this congregation, Brother Craig has did a great job of preaching that this is not the house of God, but this is. And I know you know that, but even the way our church is set up, just think about it. I'm up here and everybody else is sitting. I mean, really, think about it. You guys are sitting, and really ministry does not start until you go out there. Hopefully you can learn. Hopefully you can be exhorted and encouraged while you're here. Hopefully maybe even the Spirit may prick you a little bit while you're here this morning, but you're just sitting. This is just this is not even ministry. Ministry is when you leave those doors. So this morning I want to preach about making a difference. Be a disciple. Jesus Christ never one time called anybody a Christian. The word Christian is only used 3 times in the scripture. And every time, basically, they were called Christians first at Antioch, and it was almost like a derogatory term to the people that were calling them that. What Jesus called them was disciples. And a disciple, and by the way, he tells, toward the end of Matthew, toward the end of John, he says basically the same thing, and I'm paraphrasing. He said, go into all the world and make disciples. Preach. Do these things. He said, this is what we are supposed to do. And at one point, Jesus even said this. He said, listen, if you don't put everything aside and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. I mean, think about that. And the word disciples mentioned 269 times. That's quite a bit more than the word Christian. So this morning, I just want to talk a little bit about being a disciple. Do you want to make a difference? I know I do. I know I just thrive on hoping and praying that I am making a difference, that I'm being an influence on someone. You want to know that you're actually influencing someone's life for the glory of God. This morning, we're going to be in the book of Luke talking about a man named Matthew. Now, I preached when I was pastor, and I preached a series on making a difference, and I went through the disciples' life, and one of them I like a lot is Matthew. Now, Matthew's name is only mentioned 5 times, if that tells you anything. He's actually called Levi a few times, but put that in contrast, Peter's mentioned 96 times, so Matthew's kind of a little bit on the side, but Matthew, the calling of Matthew is a lot different than some of the others in several ways, but for one, you've often heard people say about how Jesus called people that were just poor fishermen and all this. Well, that's not Matthew. You know, we all have a little bit of a different life. I know growing up in the movement that I grew up in, I heard several preachers come and say, you know, God, he took everything from me, took my job, took all this stuff, and I just knew that God was calling me. And you know what? I know for sure that people have gone down that road, and God took their job, took everything from them, but he never dealt with me that way. He doesn't deal with you the same way he deals with everybody else. Matthew was not a poor fisherman. Matthew was a tax collector. Matthew had a different life than Peter, than John, than James, than all these guys. And the calling of Matthew is a little different. Matthew was obviously a Jew, but he decided that he was going to take a job at being a tax collector. We'll talk maybe a little bit about that in just a second, but going into discipling, going into being a Christian, David Platt, I know some of you have heard of David Platt. He has the book Follow Me, a Radical, those things. And when he talks about being a disciple, and he makes it so real. And you know what? Following Jesus is a radical decision. It is something that should change your life. If we're just sitting around, you'll never attach helium balloons to a lawn chair. I guarantee it. If you do not have a vision about doing something, then you'll just be someone who's entertained, who comes to church on Sunday morning and never takes it any farther than that. But hopefully you want to be a disciple. Hopefully that's something that you really want to do. But David Platt, when he's describing this, he talks about 3 different types of listeners. And he says, number 1, there's a casual listener. There's some people in here that are just casually listening. You came maybe because, you know, your parents used to come to church. You came maybe just because somebody invited you. Maybe you just came because you just want to see what it's like. And I hope if that's you and you're here, I hope that you'll get something this morning. I hope that you'll see when you come in here that, you know what, people here love one another. I hope that's what you see if you're that casual listener. But the second type of listener is a convinced one. And that's someone who listens to the gospel or listens to the preaching, listens to the teaching, and they're convinced that there's something more to this. This is not just a life where it's just a religious life and that's it. No, they are convinced that there's something to that. And the last type of listener that David Platt refers to is one that is committed. And I hope more than ever that we will have some committed listeners, some committed Christians, some committed disciples who will take the gospel to all the world and not just sit around. Being a disciple is an active thing. And we'll see this in Luke chapter 5. Verse number 27, as he starts out, Jesus says, and after these things he went, or it's him that's going, says, and after these things he went forth and saw a publican named Levi sitting at the receipt of custom. And he said unto him, follow me. So here's Levi. He's the publican. He's the tax collector. Now, just to give you an idea what this is, And I know I'm preaching to the choir, and some of you know exactly what this is. But he's the guy that he was a Jewish person. Now, he had to be educated to be a tax collector. He's working for the Roman government, not the Jewish people. And in order to do that, he had to understand Greek and he had to understand Hebrew because he was brought up a Jew. His name was Levi. So and a lot of people will tell you, and I'll just throw this in as a side point, skeptics will tell you, well, these guys couldn't have wrote the New Testament. They weren't even educated. Listen, Matthew was probably one of the most educated people around. And he wrote probably the earliest gospel that we have. Matthew was definitely bilingual. He definitely understood a couple languages because he was a tax collector. But in order to do that, you had to be. So the Roman government would tell him, say, okay, now you go out and you collect this amount of taxes from this family and that family. But the only way that Matthew could make money, or a tax collector could make money, was by charging them more than what the Roman government said you have to get. So if the government said, okay, from Simeon's family, you need to get $10 this month. Well, if Matthew just went and got $10 from him, he was getting nothing. So the only way he could make money was to say, okay, guys, you owe $12 this month. And he'd pocket 2 of it. And so the Jewish people did not trust the tax collectors. In fact, they hated them because they were making money off of them and they never knew how much he was supposed to be charging. He would just basically charge what he thought he needed to so he could make money, and so he made sure that he got, the Romans their money that they needed. And the Jewish people could not stand him. They didn't know whether to trust him. They didn't know anything about him. And so here he is. And even notice the words there in the verse that said he's sitting at the receipt of custom. Now, this was a public area. And it's kind of, just think about it. He's just sitting. Matthew wasn't even active. He just kind of sat there. I guess some of them would probably, they'd come around at times. They'd say, okay, now pay me this. He'd have his little list. This guy owes me 10, and obviously it wasn't $10, but you all understand the point I'm getting at. And he would charge him this much, and he was pocketing his money. He's just sitting there, and the Jews are going by him, and they're paying their fees, and they're thinking, that dirty guy. He used to be one of us. But the thing about it, there's always hope of people changing. And here's Matthew, and he's sitting here, and he's just being this guy that they didn't like. And I think in some ways he was probably a disappointment. I mean, I'm a parent. I know there's several parents in here, there's grandparents in here. You have in your mind this vision for what you want to see your kids do. It doesn't always work out the way you think. But there's always hope. If you have that wayward child, if you had that person that didn't end up exactly like you thought they would, God can still transform that person. And he does. Thank God. But we have these thoughts a lot of times, and you think, but to his parents, I'm sure they named him Levi. Levi, of course, was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, who ended up, his tribe was the ones who was the priesthood. And Matthew, who was Levi, by his parents, Levi, he was probably someone that his parents wanted him to be in the priesthood because of his name. They probably wanted him to be in a leadership position among the Jews. They probably desired this of him. They probably, in their mind, they probably pictured this happening. But Matthew took a different road. And at some point in Matthew's life, he said, you know what? They're offering me this good job. They may have just offered it to him because he spoke 2 languages. They may have offered it to him because of some situation he was in. We do not know. But Matthew took this job as the tax collector, and he was someone they did not like. And Jesus comes around. And it says, the Bible says here in the book of Luke, as he's writing here, it says, and saw a publican. And this word carries some weight. That's basically like, it's a forward type thing. It's as if to say that Jesus saw past him being a tax collector. See, Jesus can see the potential that you have. And when Jesus saw Matthew, he said, follow me. Now, this is, You think about the difference in the language here. It goes from him sitting to follow me. This is an active thing. If someone's going to follow you, they have to get up. Well, I hope. Hopefully, they have to get up because you're up. And Jesus, when he said, follow me, he didn't say, hey, Matthew, why don't you just hang out with me? Why don't you just sit here and I'll teach you everything you need to know? No, he said, follow me. He didn't say, hey, Matthew, I'm sure, we could just, hang out a little while. No, he said, follow me. It was an active thing. And he said, listen, I want you to follow me. I want you to stay with me. There's been times, like if we were going somewhere, maybe we were carpooling, meaning Laura and I, and maybe other families. It gets kind of dangerous if you get more than two people in a carpool because you never know what's going to happen. But if somebody says, follow me, and you don't know where they're going, you better keep up with them. You gotta be able to see them. You got to do what they do. If they take a right-hand turn, then you need to take a right-hand turn. You just have to follow them, and it's an active thing. And you can't do that if you're just sitting around. I hope that everybody in here wants more for your life than just coming to a Sunday morning service. Now, I hope coming to Sunday morning service is an uplift to you. I hope when you come in here week after week and you hear the worship music and you hear Pastor Craig preach, I hope that it encourages you and it makes you want to go out. But I know normally when you look at a church, there's an awful lot of people who are just on the sidelines. I'm not the most avid sports watcher, the guy that watches all the games and stuff, but I do tend to like to watch some. But it's real easy for me to sit on the sidelines and say what somebody should do. It's real easy to sit in the stand and say, did you see what just happened? I would not have done it that way. It's real easy to make assumptions. It's real easy to sit back and be critical. But when you're in the game, it's a different story. And typically, the people that make the biggest complaints are the ones that are sitting on the sidelines. But Jesus didn't call us to stand on the sidelines. Jesus said, follow me. And as long as you're just sitting back and being critical, you're not following. You're just watching. And that may not be anybody in here, but it might. I just want to encourage you to understand that we are to be disciples. We're to follow. The very word disciple means a follower. It's a student. It's a pupil. It's a follower. It's someone who literally follows, someone who does the things that Jesus did. And Jesus took that whole old covenant and he made it new. He made it less complicated but more demanding. He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And do you know what we tend to do? Just sit back, watch, and say what everybody else is doing wrong, but never get in the game. The real ministry starts after you leave here. It's real easy to sit, and I can say this because I've been guilty of it. It's real easy to sit out there and say, well, why doesn't the church help this person? Why doesn't the church do this ministry? Why doesn't the church support this person? Why don't we have missionaries in Japan? I mean, it's so easy to just sit back and make criticism after criticism. And this is what I learned. Just giving an example. If I want to help somebody, I should help them. If I think that we need to have missionaries supported in Japan, well, for crying out loud, look them up, see who's in Japan, send them a check. It's that easy. It's not that hard. It's real easy to be critical. It's real easy to be skeptical. But it's more demanding to do what Jesus said to do, and that is to love him with all your heart, to love your neighbor, to follow him. Jesus set that example better than anybody. And if you want fulfillment, if you want that fame that comes from doing what you know by making a difference, you have to be a servant. You have to do the things that Jesus did. So he calls Matthew. He says, follow me. That's the disappointment. In verse number 28, you see a decision. It says, he left all, rose up, and followed him. Now, that's pretty, when you think about it, consider the calling of the other disciples. I don't know, maybe you know all this, maybe you don't, but just briefly, if you can just think about it. Here's Andrew, for example. In the book of John, he talks about Andrew. Jesus said, Andrew, follow me. And literally, it was Andrew who went and got Peter and said, hey, come over here. And you see each of them as followers. You see, Peter and these guys, they're out working hard. Now, fishing, for us, when you think about fishing, it sounds like fun. I just saw a post on Facebook the other day. It said how important water is, because without it, you can't go fishing. And so fishing is something for us that we look at as something that can be entertaining or fun and enjoying. But for these guys, it was not that way. It was work. And you see these guys, and they're out here, and when Jesus comes to them and says, okay, throw your net over there, and they throw it over there, and then they get 153 fish, and they're like, hey, I know I need to follow this guy. These guys were working hard. They weren't making a very good living, and according to Peter's own words in the book of Acts, they weren't educated people. But Matthew was a different story. Matthew was the guy that had his own big luxurious home, no doubt. We even see this in this passage. We'll see it here in a moment. It doesn't say big and luxurious, but we'll see here in a minute. But Matthew had his own place because you know what? Matthew was a tax collector. He was working for the Roman government. Matthew was well-to-do. Matthew had a whole lot more to lose than any of the other disciples. So when Jesus said, follow me, it would have been real easy for Matthew to think, man, you know what I got to give up? And there are some of you that are in the same situation. It's almost like there's a lot of irony in the fact that God will bless us, and the more he blesses us, the harder it is for us to follow him sometimes. And we see it time after time after time. I could tell you individuals in my mind that I have seen this with. And when it's like you get blessed, and it's like, well, the more you're blessed, it's like, well, I can't give this up. I can't give up my, on and on. You can't give up your great job. I can't give up my nice house. I can't give up that new vehicle I got or that classic Ford truck. That's really what I want. I'll just be honest. A lot of people, they get to that midlife, which, by the way, if you define midlife, I'm already past it, really. I don't like to admit that, but if you multiply your age by 2 and it's past when you may live, you're past midlife. It's that simple. Don't get discouraged because of that. I'm just telling you. But a lot of people, they love to get, maybe it's a Porsche or a Ferrari or whatever that car is that Laura pointed out yesterday. She always points out these nice sports cars. What I want is like a 76 or 78 Ford truck. If you got one, let me know. I sold one right before I moved down here, got $400 out of it, but I couldn't get it fixed up and said I'll just get rid of it. I'm going to get me another one of these days. But you know what? When it come down to the point of, okay, Clark, do you want to haul that thing down to North Carolina? This is just a small thing. I'm just saying, or are you willing to give that up? Well, that was the easy thing to give up. But there's so many things in our lives that God blesses us with, and we just sit back and think, we don't voice it. We may not even say it, but deep down we're thinking, well, when it comes to retirement age, I want to have this kind of money. I want to have this kind of life. But this is what Jesus said, follow me. Now, listen, I'm not against planning for retirement. I'm getting at that age now where I'm starting to think, not about retiring, but I'm starting to think about how am I going to prepare for it? You know, when you're 25 years old, you think you're going to live forever, you don't worry about it. But you don't. And I can tell you this, it does go faster, at least it has for me. The best thing I can do is just not think about it. The weeks go into months, the months go into years. You know what is important? And the older you get, the more that I think about how fast it goes, is the more I understand that we only have one life, and that's why the only thing that matters is if we follow Jesus or not. Because when you get to heaven, I guarantee you, you're not going to walk by the pearly gates, as the jokes say. Peter's not going to be standing out there. He's not going to say, you left $25,000 to your kids. Check. Here's an extra crown for you. Hey, well, you know what? You had a 2-story house with 4 bedrooms. You could have put up a missionary every now and then. Check. It's not like that. You're going to be judged on the things you did, whether it was good or whether it was bad. And the things that we have now do not matter. And if you have the same worldview that I was brought up with, and what that means is I was brought up with the understanding that if you're a child of God, if you believed on the Lord Jesus Christ, that you're going to heaven. And this is just temporary. Thank God this is temporary. Because if I thought this was the only thing I had, I would have gave up a long time ago. Because thank God we have a home prepared. And if I know, my mom and dad, great Christians, it's easy for me to be here and them in West Virginia. You know why? Because if something happens to them today, I believe I'll see them again. You thank God that I have that. And so that's just a little part of it. And he says, I want you to follow me. And so here's his decision. He said he left all, rose up, and he followed him. So now you see his desire in the next verse. It says, and Levi made him a great feast, verse 29, in his own house. So it says it was a big feast, a great feast. It was right there. So Matthew was well-to-do. And Matthew said there was a great company of publicans and others that sat down with them. And even notice that again. You see what they're doing? They're sitting down. You know what? It seems like all you have to do is go on a keto diet or a low-carb diet, and you find out there's not much you can do with people. Because everything you do is based on food, it seems like. And every time you go to somebody's house and they got cinnamon rolls or something I just seen this morning, you know what? You're thinking, I can't do it. And you don't even know how to talk to people because you're like, okay, it seems like everything we do is based on sitting down and having a meal together. But that's not ministry. Fellowship is great. Coming to church, sitting, maybe listening to some preaching, some singing, that's good. But that's not ministry. That's not making any difference whatsoever. It might make a little difference in your life, but you're not influencing anyone by just sitting here. And so when he sees him and he says, Matthew's desire, he said that he had this big feast in his house and there was a great company of publicans and others that sat down with him. Now notice it says publicans and others. Do you remember what the publicans were? They were the tax collectors. These were the hated people. These were the very ones that when you read through the Gospels and you see Peter and John and these others and they see Jesus making a big difference with publicans and sinners, they say, what are you doing sitting down with those people? And so here's Matthew. He just become a follower of Jesus Christ. Now in our language, that's basically saying Matthew just got saved. But he just become a follower of Jesus Christ. He said, listen, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to give everything up that I have, and I'm going to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And so Matthew was just so crazy that he thought, well, I want my friends in on this. You know, a lot of times I find, at least it seems like in my mind, the way I grew up was you would look at certain people. Maybe they weren't tax collectors. Maybe they were certain people that were living a lifestyle that you had been taught was wrong, and we would look at them. I would, as a younger person, I would say, well, I don't want to hang around with them. But let me tell you something. I just read an article, and I'm not telling you to hang around and do the things that they're doing, but listen. I just read an article by a man named Brett Krunkle, and he was making a point, and he said, people are very rarely do a favor for a stranger. People very rarely are influenced a lot by strangers. If you're going to ask somebody a favor, you know what? A lot of times, you might want to make sure you know who they are. And here's the point that I'm trying to make. We can sit back and say, well, I wish this person would come to church, or I wish this person would, give their heart to Jesus Christ, or I wish this person would do this or that. If you are not going out of your way to be an influence on them, then who will? Are you making a difference in their life? Because I promise you that when Jesus said to love your neighbors as yourself, he wasn't talking about your brother that lived across the road necessarily. I mean, when you read the parable of the Good Samaritan, listen, he's the only guy that was not a priest, that was not a Jew. He was the only one that would help him. He was the guy that they looked at and said, you're a sinner. And he's the one that helped him. And so if we want to sit back and say, well, I would love to see this person get right with God. Well, you know what? What are you doing to influence them? Are you at least being a friend to them? There are Muslims today that are converted, that become believers in Jesus Christ. They say the average Muslim takes about 7 years of someone continually talking to them to influencing them. It's not something that happens overnight. If you want to influence somebody, you have to be in their life. Invite them out to breakfast. Mow their yard for them. On and on and on. Whatever if you see a need somewhere, do it. And if you want to influence their life, then I promise you that's the best way you can do it. Not by sitting. It's real easy to sit back and talk about people. It's real easy to sit back and say, well, why don't somebody do this, but why don't we? And here we see in this the desire that Matthew said, I am going to invite these other tax collectors. And so here he is, he's inviting these publicans and the others. They sat down, it says, but the scribes in verse 30, the scribes and the Pharisees murmured against his disciples, saying, why do you eat and drink with publicans and sinners? They looked back and they said exactly what we have heard so many people say. What maybe I've even said myself. And we sit back and say, well, what are they doing with them? What are they doing talking with that person? Well, maybe they're just being a follower of Jesus Christ. Maybe they're just doing the things that Jesus said we're supposed to do. Here, Matthew, he invited all of them, and they're being critical. I heard Andy Stanley. I got a 2.5-hour drive to work if I don't stop. Obviously, if you stop, it's a little longer. But that gives me a lot of time to listen to things. And when you're driving, you're not supposed to just be looking at your phone. But every now and then I'll put in a good podcast or something. And then when it goes off, I got to find something else because I'm not smart enough to know, how to download it all and have it all lined up. And so I'll be driving, and I'll kind of flipping through there. And the next thing down on the list was an interview with Andy Stanley. And by the way, whether you like him or not, doesn't matter to me. But I will say this, his most recent book, Irresistible, is probably the best book I've ever read. I encourage you to read it. Encourage you to get the audio on it if you don't want to read it, if you can't read it, listen to it. But he was being interviewed. And the person interviewing him said, Andy said, so many people have come out and criticized you because of this book. Said, how does that make you feel? And this is what he said. He said, well, Sandra and I, which is his wife, said, Sandra and I, we've talked about this a lot, and we often say when other Christians criticize us, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really bother me. He said, who I'm trying to be an influence on is everybody else. And he said, really, what we say, he said, when we're talking, Sandra and I, and another Christian's being critical of us, we just look at each other and say, well, at least they're going to heaven. And you think about it. Now, I've been in a ministry in some capacity personally for at least 20 years, at least teaching, more than that, really, and teaching in some capacity. And I've found a lot of times, whether it's within your congregation or just outside in other congregations and other denominations, the people that have been the most critical to me personally have been other Christians. And you know what we have to do? just follow Jesus, because we're not worried about them. In that sense, I want to influence them, but I'm not going to let them drag me down. If I did, I would have quit a long time ago. If I didn't think there was hope for this generation that I see filling up that pew and for others that I see around, this younger, if I didn't think there was hope for them being the grace generation, to be the one that will make a difference, to be the one that will bring revival to this country, if I didn't think there was some hope, I'd quit. Right here in this county, I said not here, but I've said this in a couple places. In Surry County, there are 34,000 people in this county that are listed with no religious affiliation. 34,000 people in Surry County, North Carolina that are listed with no religious affiliation. Think about that and tell me there's not some work to do right here. Well, we could come, we've been here about 3 months and people would say, yeah, there's not much goes on in Mount Airy. Well, number one, there's more here than there was in Monroe County, West Virginia, I promise. When the population was 27 people per square mile, it was a little different than here. I could bring up some different things and just show you pictures, but it's not really relevant. But the point is, there's a lot of people here. But I could come here and people say, everybody goes to church down there. You think? Or people say, well, everybody identifies as a Christian in Surry County, North Carolina. A lot of them don't even know what that means. It's a nominal Christianity. It's the casual listener that David Platt talked about to begin with. It's someone that grew up in a family and their family said, yeah, we're Christians. It's the people that, they're still patriotic. They'll say, well, nobody's taking my guns, nobody's taking my flag, and I'm a Christian, but they don't even know what it means. And they have no desire whatsoever to follow Jesus because they don't know what he did. They don't know anything about it. They know the Bible's a good book and you don't set your coffee cup on top of it, but they don't have any idea what's in it. And they are all around you, I promise. And they'd say, well, yeah, as long as you got that strong concordance and the old KJV and all this, and they'd say, yeah, we got it, and they don't even have any idea where the New Testament starts, where the Old stops, what that means. And they are all around you every day. And I promise you that we have a huge job to do right here in Surry County, North Carolina. I promise you that in Mount Airy, there's people around you that need to see the love of Christ. But they'll never see it as long as we're just sitting around. They'll never see it if we're just going from our humdrum day to day. Maybe you go to work, maybe you go to, Riverside Park and jog. I don't know what it is you do. But unless we're trying to influence other people, there'll never be any difference made. So Jesus answers, says, but in verse 31, Jesus answered and said to them, they that are whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Think about what he's saying. It's basically kind of like the interview that I was just talking about with Andy Stanley. Listen, who we're supposed to influence is the ones that need it. Otherwise, it's just a country club. Otherwise, we just get together and everybody talks and we have a good time and then we just leave and go home and say, hey, that was a good message. Or you say, hey, that was an awful message. I hope he never speaks again. Whatever it is you say, the point is, whether you like it or not, whether you like Brother Craig or myself, or whether you like the singing, whatever it is, the ministry will not start just from that. It starts after you leave here. And we see the difference that it made in Matthew's life. He was a publican. When he writes his own scripture, his own writing in the book of Matthew, which, by the way, these guys were writing this. They did not know they were writing the Bible. They were writing a letter so that this could be documented, so that they could keep this. And really, most people believe that James and Matthew and John and these guys, they started writing because once the first James got martyred, about 55 AD or something like that, they all sit back and they said, okay, hey, listen, we're going to lose our lives. We better write this stuff down so people can remember it. And right now, Matthew wrote his gospel, and he wrote down that he was just a publican. It was a humbling thing for him to call himself. But Matthew, who never went to synagogue, probably because he was a tax collector, his parents may have wanted him to because they called him Levi. He probably never went to synagogue. He probably never did any of that. But you see in his gospel, he quotes the Old Testament, which was their scriptures. It was all they had. They didn't have what we have in the New Testament. They had these Jewish scriptures, all that Old Testament that we have. He quoted that 96 times. That was more than Mark, Luke, and John put together. It made such a difference in Matthew's life that he probably got in there. He started searching to see exactly what he could learn. He followed Jesus closely. You don't hear a lot about him. You know, and sometimes that's some of your best disciples. They don't care if they're in front. I could name people right here in this congregation I know that have, just in the 3 months I've been here, I've seen them do things without any recognition. They don't want any. They don't. You know what? Sometimes that's some of the best disciples. You know, to stand up in front and give this message is some of the easiest stuff I do all week. I love this. But the day-to-day part of being a disciple, of being a follower of Jesus Christ, is where the rubber meets the road. That is the ministry that takes place. And if you're just sitting, it never happens. So we see what a difference this made in Matthew's life. And so if the gospel, if Jesus Christ, if the love of Jesus changed you, or if you've heard it, if you're more than just a casual listener, shouldn't it change you? Shouldn't it make you want to go out and tell it? Shouldn't it make you want to do the things that Jesus did? Shouldn't it make you want to spend time with him in prayer and Bible study and try to get involved with a small group here where you can really get to know people and learn more about what Jesus said and about just on and on and on? Wouldn't it make us want to be a little different? Wouldn't it make us want to not just sit around? Because as Larry said, a man can't just sit around. We have got to do something. Jesus said, if you don't pick up your cross and follow me, you cannot be a disciple. He said, if you don't forsake all and follow me, you cannot be a disciple. It is a radical calling. It is a calling of a life change. I'm going to tell one story here as the worship team makes their way back up here, if you would. A man by the name of, and I'll mispronounce this. I'll say his name was Franciszek Gadziwanczyk. He was Polish. I know I missaid that. So from now on, I'll just call him Francis. Francis was in Auschwitz in the 40s. And in Auschwitz, of course, that concentrate, the camp for the Jewish people where they were killing everybody during World War II. Somebody had escaped. And so the Nazis said, okay, 10 people are going to what they called the hunger chamber. And they would put them in there for 10 days, no food, no water, no anything, and they would die. Francis was one of the 10 people that when the Nazis pointed out, they said, you are going to the hunger chambers. And this was in the 40s, obviously. And so when they said, okay, you're going, there was a priest by the name of Maximilian Kolbe. That's a cool name, I think. He was a priest. He was also there. And he said, I want to take his place. Francis has kids. He has a wife. And I want to take his place. And they said that Maximilian Kolbe, the 10 days they were in the hunger chamber, he led them with singing. He led them with different things. Ended up, him and 3 others lived the 10 days. So for 4 more days he was there. And finally they give him a lethal injection of carbolic acid to kill him. But Francis never forgot what Maximilian Kolbe did for him. And it says, they said that every year he would go back to where it happened to remember what Maximilian Kolbe did. For the rest of his life, he died when he was 94 years old, not too many years ago. And for the rest of his life, he would go and he would give speeches and he would talk about what one guy did for him. How I would not be here if it would not have been for that priest, for Maximilian Kolbe. I would not be here. Think about you. Maximilian Kolbe didn't die for you, but Jesus Christ did. If that has the least little bit of influence on your life, it should make you want to be a follower of him. It should make you want to get up and get into the real ministry. just be praying for a little while as the worship team. I think they have a song to do. If you would just bow your heads, maybe there's some in here that they may want to do business with Jesus this morning. We have an altar that's open. Maybe you want to come down here to this altar of prayer while they're singing and say, you know what, I want to make a difference. Maybe you're not even sure if you're saved this morning. Maybe you want somebody to pray with you this morning. As they sing, the altar's open.